thank you, Alan, and particularly thanks to Christine for those very interesting papers and comments on the topic that's before us today. A couple of things strikes me about what was said there. First of all, I'd like to just echo what Alan said over my involvement in the private rented sector, stretching back to the Commission on the Private Rented Residential Sector. I have noted an increasing disposition in the Department of Housing to look more scientifically at how the housing system works and to make judgments and to make decisions based on evidence. So I think Alan's making a very good point there. The second point he made, which was that you can study housing through economics, but there is a point that it also has a big sociological dimension, and it's important that the two of those are kind of married together. And I think that point was well made by Alan. Christine raised a whole pile of interesting points, not least of which is that it should be, I suppose, reassuring is a word I wouldn't like to use, but we should be interested to hear that our housing problems are not unique to Ireland, that they are not dissimilar to an awful lot of problems that an awful lot of other countries are having. And we can therefore look abroad. And I think what Christine did there very well was give us a brief summary of what is happening abroad, because I think we will learn from what is happening abroad. And I think it's important that we do understand more thoroughly what's happening abroad, because often the debates about housing in this country are framed on the basis that there's some sort of nirvana of renting on the continent, which is not true. So thanks, Christine, for that. The other point Christine raised, which I think is really interesting, is this whole issue of rent control. And she makes the point that an awful lot of economics, economic analysis of rent control is based on what Christine called first generation. And it's the experience that happened after rent control was brought in during the First World War and subsequently reinforced in the Second World War and then not reformed through the 60s and 70s. That's a very important point. I think there's a lot more research that could be done on rent controls. And I always make a distinction between rent control, which is what people think is what happened over those periods, and rent certainty measures. There is great scope for bringing in rent certainty measures, and Christine made that point, I think, very well, that institutional investors in particular are not that concerned about rent certainty measures. They certainly would be concerned about very strict forms of rent control, where they lose control over the property they have to manage. But I think that point is well made. And if I could just go on and make two other points. One is that I think what came out of that discussion, I think the questions, which are very good, was the need to see the housing system as a whole and not just examine the private rented sector in its own entity. That the private rented sector is, if you like, a buffer between the social rented sector and the owner-occupied sector. And therefore, whatever happens in those other two sectors has a big impact on what happens in the private rented sector. And outside that housing system, we've got to remember that the housing system itself has complexities which emanate from other systems in society. Alan Barrett mentioned pensions. Our pension structure is predicated on the majority of people owning their own homes. And as the number of people owning their own homes reduces, we're going to face a problem with pensions. So therefore, when you're looking at housing, one has got to look at the pension system. Equally, one's got to look at the taxation system and the social welfare system. So you've got to not only look at the private rented sector in aspect, you've got to look at it against the whole housing system and then against other systems in society. And unless we do that, we could end up with a whole pile of unintended consequences when we try and reform the system. And so I think those things are kind of important points to make at the outset. So thank you for indulging me, allowing me to make those comments. We'll move on now to the next section, which we are going to enjoy, I think. And there's four contributors here. And the first is from Conor O'Toole, who's an associate research professor in the ESRI and has done an awful lot of work on the housing, which I think most people find very interesting and very informative, and is making a great contribution to keeping this debate on housing informed, which, as I said before, is very good. So Conor, can I ask you to talk about the impact of COVID-19 on the Irish rental sector? Thanks, Conor.
Thanks very much, Tom. And bear with me 1 second while I share the screen. So thank you very much, Tom, I guess what I'm going to try and do today, always impossible to follow up a presentation like Christine's, but what I thought I'd do for this morning was to just try and contextualize some of the trends that we've seen in the private rental sector in Ireland since the onset of COVID, and to explore some of the work that we've done, particularly last year, on looking at the structure of the COVID shock and what the impact we expected could be on households from an affordability perspective. And then I'm going to try and talk a little bit about the outlook and what the type of pressures and trends that we may see going forward. So let me start at the very general. So obviously the chart here presents the standardized average rent and the inflation rates of the year-on-year growth rate in the standardized average rent from the rent index work that we do with the RTB. So this chart goes up to the end of 2020, so Q4 2020. And the red line here shows the annual rate of inflation. And what you can see very clearly is after the pandemic hit, there was a very clear moderation in the inflation rate. So the rate of inflation dropped well below 5% and has stayed there for the 4 quarters of last year. And you can very clearly see that this was quite a departure from the inflation that we'd had before that period, which was moderating since the onset of the RBZs, but certainly had remained well above 5%. So very clear impact of the initial pandemic shock on prices. Now, we did see a tick back up towards the end of last year, but in general, the inflation rates had remained below what we had seen in the period before the onset of the pandemic. Obviously, behind a headline index, there's lots of different trends and different heterogeneous effects happening, and I think some of these are very interesting to explore. So if we look here at the chart, which provides the inflation rate split out by dwelling type, so basically splits out houses versus apartments, you can see the moderation was across the board after the onset of COVID, but while housing fell faster, house dwellings fell faster, apartments have kind of stayed flatlined after that initial Q2 drop in the inflation rate. And I guess one of the interesting aspects that we have to think about here in relation to the varying trends in the inflation rate is whether or not there's structural differences that are occurring on either the demand or the supply side of the market that are leading to these varying effects, and in particular with apartment rentals much more concentrated in the big urban centres, thinking about whether there's differences across urban areas versus the non-urban areas is an interesting trend. And that's where I'm going to go next, because this is, to me, is certainly one of the quite striking features of the change in rental prices since COVID. Certainly was what we've seen is in the urban areas, in particular in Dublin, which you can see in the red line here. The inflation rate dropped quite dramatically in Dublin and was in negative territory for much of last year on an annualized basis. We also saw falls in Cork and Galway. Cork is the blue line here, Galway is the green line here. Although there was a tip back up towards the end of the year, this does appear to point towards a major moderation in the inflation rate. And for Dublin County accounts for nearly 50% of registered tenancies every year. So adjustments in Dublin matter for the national picture. It's a very large component of the rental sector. But really, when we think about COVID and we think about the type of factors that we've discussed in recent years or in recent months, COVID, we asked, has it changed the preferences on the demand side? So are households thinking about different aspects? For example, do they value green space more? Do they want to move out of urban centres more towards more suburban areas? And are any of these factors driving the relative impacts on an urban versus non-urban perspective? Not necessarily in position to say anything about those trends. These are to take a little bit of time to really understand them in more detail, but certainly the moderation in Dublin is quite an interesting development. Well, can we move from kind of prices towards activity? Well, what this chart here shows is the number of tenancies that we use in the sample, which generates the rent index. At the absolute level is in the dots and the blue line, and then the year-on-year change is the little red line. We can see is when the pandemic hit, second quarter of 2020, there was a major drop in tenancy registrations. Obviously, that makes sense, given that the shutdown of economic and social life occurred, and many people weren't able to register those tenancies or weren't changing accommodation. So there's a natural drop in activity there, but there was a spike up then in the third quarter and the fourth quarter relative to the previous growth rates that we'd seen. So you can see the impacts of the pandemic here. Now, obviously, one of the things with tenancies is that obviously when there's a tenancy registered, that is, in a sense, has elements of both the demand and the supply side in that agreement, because the tenancy has to be agreed by both buyer and seller. So maybe a better way of thinking about what has happened on the supply side is to look at listings. So what these data here show is the flow of listings, so the average monthly number of ads by region and year from the daft.ie website. And what you can actually see quite clearly is that in 2020, there was actually an increase in the average number of listings per month in Dublin. And you can see Dublin is on the left-hand chart here. So in the city centre, South City, North City, there was an increase in average listings, but that wasn't necessarily the case in the suburban areas of Dublin. Some similar trends in the other cities. So again, this concept of maybe some sort of increases in the number of listings available in those areas, city areas. Obviously, this didn't come through into many other areas. So what this chart here shows is it's a similar average number of ads by region and year, and it covers the Dublin County, excluding the city, the Ulster area, Munster, Connacht, and Leinster outside these urban areas, and we don't see that supply response. So it seems to be something in the urban areas that's a little bit different. Well, what might be explaining that? There's probably a number of factors on both the demand and the supply sides explaining these differences. One may be something that Christine touched on earlier, which is the Airbnb stock. You can see the chart on the right-hand side here covers some work we're trying to do with the Inside Airbnb database. And this captures the total number of Airbnb hosts that are listed on the website at different points over time. And you can see after the introduction, or after the hit of the pandemic began, there did appear to be a drop in the number of listed hosts. That isn't conclusive, these are just correlations, but there does appear to be some changes that may be occurring in relation to that. So that kind of gives a general overview of the markets. We have a drop in the inflation rate relative to the pre-pandemic period. We see somewhat increase in listings, and so the key question is, what does that say to affordability? These concepts that we're really interested in, and what about the rental households themselves? So obviously, the affordability has been a huge issue. Some research that we'd done before highlights the impact of the pandemic was disproportionately affecting the type of sectors, the unemployment shock that renters were more represented in. And that has implications on what we think about for the affordability shock and the outlook. And obviously, when we think about affordability, what really matters for affordability is whether the relative growth rate of income is greater than the growth rate of rents and other costs. And obviously, if incomes are growing faster than rents and other costs, then affordability is improving, and vice versa. So this is the kind of context that we were thinking about from the pandemic's perspective. I think to just kind of contextualize this is a chart which shows the average rent to income ratio from a previous paper that we did. Each of the four bars capture different quartiles of the income distribution. The purple bar, which is the first quartile, are the lowest income households, down to the red bar, which is the highest income households. We can see that for renting households, the average rent to income ratio was very high. It was nearly 40% for lower income households up to 2015. So this shows that the kind of structural effects over time of the high housing payment cost to income ratios for lower income renters. It's kind of contextualizes what came before the pandemic period. So one of the things that we did early on in the pandemic, and Alan mentioned research that was funded by the Department of Housing. This particular study was funded under the research program that we had with the department. And what we're trying to do is look at, could we simulate the impact of the pandemic on households to see, could we get a sense of what was happening to affordability? So what we did was we looked at the unemployment shock, we looked at it by sector. We looked at the income supports that were brought in. So this piece of work was done in the summer of 2020. So at that stage, we had the pandemic unemployment and we had the temporary wage subsidy scheme at that particular time. And we tried to simulate what we thought would happen to households when that shock came on. One of the other things that we saw with the pandemic was household spending changed. And we tried to model the changes to the consumption basket that were happening at the time of the pandemic, as well as the income shocks. So what do? We try to use this what we call a residual income approach. So basically we're asking, how much do households have left after rent, and is that sufficient to cover a minimum standard of living? So we use this ratio that we talk about in income sufficiency ratio, which is basically the money left after housing cost, and whether that's and divide that then by the some sort of measure of a minimum standard of living. We use here the Vincentian Partnership minimum expenditure data. And if that ratio is greater than 1, then you've more money left relative to this benchmark. If it's less than 1, then you don't have enough money to cover this benchmark after housing cost. So what you can see in the table here, and I'll draw people's attention to the bottom line, which is the easiest to explain, which is the percentage of households in each of these 3 scenarios that I'll talk through, who have an income sufficiency ratio that we judge to be less than 1. So they don't have enough income left to cover this minimum spending after housing cost. Our simulations suggest that just before the pandemic, that was 1 in 3 of the private renting households who don't have support towards their housing costs. So for example, we're on local authority rents or receiving the kind of HAP payments and the like. When the pandemic hit, then we simulate the effects. That rises to about 41% of households. But then when we adjust the households to look at what consumption changes were happening, so for example, households didn't have to make some of the spending decisions that they would normally make because these avenues were cut off by the early administrative measures, then actually we saw that there was maybe an improvement in some of the short-term the short-term measures. And this may be one of the reasons, I mean, not fully explanatory, but one of the reasons why the household distress wasn't as much as we necessarily expected in the early part of the pandemic. So let me just turn briefly to the outlook. Obviously, our forecast that I'm involved in with the ESRI through our quarterly economic commentary is forecasting quite a strong outlook for the general economy. And in a sense, what does that mean for the rental market? So if we think about the main factors that affect the rental market, or the rental inflation, or the labour market, and affordability effects, and obviously the supply measures. But if we think about the labour market, we've had a huge disruption to the labour market. This is the COVID adjusted unemployment rate. You can see remained very high in April, similar level in May of this year. But we're forecasting this to drop quite strongly. So we do expect quite a marked return if we're able to reopen in line with the current measures. Now, obviously, the issues around the Delta variant and the epidemiological outlook are maybe changing quite quickly, but in a sense, we still expect quite a strong recovery in the labour market. That said, the sectors that renters necessarily work in are quite badly affected by some of the pandemic effects. In particular, some of the previous research done by the ESRI suggested that the type of sectors that renters were more involved in were those like hotels, accommodation, retail activity, which require contact and require personal interaction. And we can see this chart here, which shows the PUP recipients, even though the absolute number has fallen, the type of sectors that have people still receiving POP recipients are much more orientated towards those sectors which are predominantly rental households involved in. So it is still a challenging labour market, even though we do expect the overall situation to improve. So obviously, as I've said, the economic recovery is expected to be strong, and the employment prospects should improve. But some of this may put pressure on the rental market. Now, naturally, the policy context is really important here, in particular the rent stabilisation measures that are in place and are to be announced. If these are effective in putting a cap on the inflation rate, then these can offset some of the rental pressures that may materialise. In a sense, this is a kind of long-standing comments that we make in the ESRI, and the research that we've been doing in the ESRI is that the long-term solution is increased supply, and we see potential for the cost rental tenure in Ireland to play a role here. And also obviously the research shows a preference for renters to become homeowners, and this may or may not materialise. So certainly a situation where affordability is likely to continue to remain an issue for a large proportion of the rental sector. And at that, I'll stop it. So thank you very much, Tom.
Thanks very much, Conor. That was really interesting. And thanks very much for exposing the impacts of COVID on the rental sector. A couple of things that struck me about it. One is that the asymmetric effects of COVID on large urban areas and other areas in the country. And this, I think, would be expected, but it is interesting. And it does point to a certain amount of concern that if you bring in national policies that will affect rural areas and large urban areas, there could be some sort of mismatch there. And it points to the complexity that the government have in trying to deal with this. And the other point that I took from that is just that housing affordability is, of course, the critical issue, both in the rental sector and the owner-occupied sector. But your slide there showing the lower incomes sectors have particular problems. And one of the things that struck me about that is, as people who are on low incomes, if they run into affordability problems and run into homelessness, this can be a real problem, because I think one of the greatest problems in the whole housing sphere is that possibility of ending up homelessness, and that's got to be a real worry. And as you said too, that as the economy normalizes and people get back to work, there might be effects there in terms of pressures on the rental sector, where I think it will be met, particularly because the point you made, and you made very well, is that the people who are affected mostly by COVID are often renters. So I'd just like to thank you, Conor. We're not going to take questions at this stage unless somebody just has a quick question. I see Pat Farrell there says, just asking a question. Pat, if you could very quickly just maybe ask that question. We'll move on to the second presentation for the afternoon. Pat? Yeah.
It's just a quick one, because Conor made reference to the measures that were announced overnight, but there's an irony in a sense in something else he said, which was around, on the one hand, these relief measures, on the other hand, we need more supply. And I'm not sure, again, in terms of the law of unintended consequences, there's a direct contradiction there, because the announcement of the measures, they've linked it to a particular index of inflation. We all know that the cost of construction inflation at the moment is multiples of that. We also know that there's a huge need to invest in ESG across the whole housing stock of apartment rentals that's there at the moment, to retrofit, to come into compliance with standards for climate change, etc., and the whole area of maintenance. And how one can actually make the business case for an investor to do that while they get an uplift on their rent of 0.73%, which, correct me if I'm wrong, Conor, is the current inflation rate under that index. It's just not possible. Yeah. So how do you bring on more supply, and how do you create the business case for people to invest in more supply when you have measures like what have just been announced? That's just my question, maybe to leave sitting there.
Yeah, Conor, do you want to respond to that? We'll have a good possibility this afternoon of discussing some of these issues in the wider session. But Conor, do you want to respond to that immediately, particularly as we've had that announcement this morning from the Minister?
Yeah, I guess I just respond quite briefly. I think one of the important points, and it comes back to what Christine was mentioning today, is that the debate about rent controls or rent stabilization measures, it can be quite difficult to identify empirically, right? And some of the effects on the supply side can be offset by the calibration of the measures. For example, if there are exemptions for new supply, so that price can be just determined by the market. So if a unit is new to the market and that price is set by what the cost of bringing that unit on, and then whatever the market price is, well, then that offsets the effect of any indexation. So I think to think about the operationalization of rent stabilization measures, I think a critical component of that is the continued exemption for new supply, where the pricing for the initial rent price that will be set at that. I think it's an important component of rent stabilization measures.
Thanks, Conor. I think we'll be able to come back to that this afternoon. I think Christine made a good point, which I just remind people about. And she said that often those rent control or rent stabilization or rent certainty measures have the effect of smoothing out change that's going to take place rather than inhibiting it absolutely. So I think that's a very good point, Pat. Thanks for making it, and we'll come back to that in the afternoon, I'm pretty sure. The second paper we have this morning is going to be interesting too, because we're going to look at the north of Ireland and see what the impact of COVID-19 on private renters in Northern Ireland is. So we have Martina McAuley, who is the Research and Evaluation Officer at Housing Rights Northern Ireland. So Martina, if I could call on you to deliver your paper. I see you there. Thanks very much, Martina.
Thanks very much, Tom. I'm just going to share my screen here. Hopefully you can see that now. So thanks very much for the opportunity to talk to you today. I just want to talk a bit about the research that we did last year, so towards the end of last year. It explored the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on private renters in Northern Ireland. A perfect storm refers to the rare combination of several factors that combine to enhance the devastation that could be brought about by any one of the factors alone. And the term became popularized after the 1997 book and subsequent movie of the same name. So there were several factors which came together to make the impact of the pandemic on private renters more pronounced. And that's the focus of my presentation today. So in carrying out the research, I made use of case records at Housing Rights for the period from March to June of 2020. And in those are extensive case notes, which formed the basis of the data for the research. And they're a really important source of evidence for what's happening in some parts of the private rented sector in Northern Ireland. So it's important to highlight the economic context in which our clients find themselves during this time. And I think the important thing to draw your attention to is the unequal path into this pandemic, which was experienced by people, and the very unequal impact that it had across sectors and across tenures. So we know that there were sectors which were hardest hit when lockdowns and other restrictions were brought in response to the pandemic. People working in accommodation and food were more likely to be furloughed, and we know that young people and those on casual contracts were more likely to be working in these sectors, as well as more likely to be living in private rented accommodation. There was also a 60% reduction in the number of job vacancies recorded between June 2019 and June 2020, with a similar reduction in part-time and casual work, which is more likely to affect students and young workers, as well as women with caring responsibilities who may need to work part-time. So this only refers to job vacancies, not the number of jobs of this type that were lost or people who were on furlough. So we can see that the number of new claims for universal credit spiked between March and May, coinciding with the first lockdown, but also that new claims for housing support increased at this time too. And bearing in mind that those claiming housing support at this point were primarily renters, I wanted to look a bit more closely at who was applying for this support. So we can see from this graph that the majority of new claims for housing support between March and May of last year were from private tenants. And this suggests that private tenants were more likely to be affected by the affordability issues related to the pandemic. The proportion of new claims for support for housing costs were on average 15% higher among private tenants than social tenants in the year leading up to the pandemic. However, between March and May, the rate of new claims from private rented sector tenants was more than double that of social tenants. And it's important to note here that this data relates to new claims for housing costs. because that sharp decline doesn't mean that the number of claims reduced, but that the number of new claims reduced at this time. So the aim of the research was to make use of evidence of the impact which COVID-19 and the subsequent lockdown had on individuals and households who contacted housing rights, some of whom were relying on benefits for the first time and having to navigate the benefit system for the first time. And it was helping them to address systemic issues which have been put into stark relief by the pandemic. So a selection of these cases was chosen to illustrate the experiences of clients in the categories which were identified as being representative of clients with similar experiences. It's important to stress that all of the data has been fully anonymised. In some cases, important features which could identify a client have been changed or removed, and all the names changed. So this is hugely important in protecting our clients' identities, whilst at the same time acknowledging their experience as an important source of evidence. So during the period between March and June 2020, 1 in 5 of all cases recorded in Housing Rights Case Recording System related primarily to COVID-19. As this graph shows, 1 in 3 private tenants who contacted Housing Rights during this period were seeking advice on an issue which was primarily related to COVID-19, compared to 1 in 10 social tenants and 1 in 5 homeowners. So almost 2/3 of the private rented sector cases were to do with the pandemic and lockdown, had affordability issues. 4 in 10 feared eviction at some point in the future. And around half of the cases reviewed regarding affordability issues provided information regarding the type of work which clients engaged in. And over half of these were self-employed, and around a third were working in hospitality. And the remainder worked in construction, leisure, retail and transport. It was clear from the case records that many of those seeking help for their housing issues during this time were already in a precarious position before the pandemic began. And I've referred to this as pre-existing conditions. We'll look a bit at these issues in more detail in a minute. So looking at cases between March and June of 2020, we can see that there was a downward trend in affordability issues compared to an upward trend for issues relating to notice to quit. And these trends likely reflect the impact of important policy interventions, such as the Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme and the Self-Employed Income Support Scheme, and the extension of the notice to quit period, potentially leading to an increase in the number of queries as clients sought to clarify their position with regard to their tenancy as the new regulations come into effect. So when we look at the issues driving those affordability problems, we can see that even clients who had been able to be supported by the furlough scheme had significant affordability issues. For some, it was the case that they had been just about managing before the pandemic hit, and a 20% reduction in wages was enough to cause affordability issues. Others, like Neil, found his furlough payment was based on his contracted hours, which amounted to 2 days a week. However, he usually worked 5 days a week. And this led to a situation where he was receiving 32% of his usual pay via the furlough scheme rather than 80%. And it's important to remember that not everyone was working for an employer who would or could implement the scheme. Joe worked for a small cafe and the owner wasn't in a financial position to continue to pay staff while applying for government support. Eve faced a similar situation when the reduction in hours worked left her with half her usual take-home pay, and it wasn't enough to cover her rent and other expenses. Eve had moved into the property 3 weeks before lockdown and contacted Housing Rights in June when her landlord was threatening to evict her due to arrears. Many of those who contacted Housing Rights in the first month or two were students who were no longer living at their term time address. 2/3 of those students had affordability issues and they'd lost their part-time work altogether or were furloughed on low contracted hours. Many of these students were no longer able to afford the private tenancy, which had been affordable previously due to their income from part-time work. Some students worried about their guarantors being liable for their rent for the remainder of their tenancies, like Sam, whose parents were his guarantors, but they themselves were struggling financially, having also been affected by reduced income and were unable to afford to pay for his rent as well as their own housing costs. Many of those clients contacting Housing Rights for help who were applying for universal credit for the first time were disheartened to learn of the level of support for their rent. None of them had expected to need state support to pay for the rent, and they had rented properties which were affordable for them, given their income at the time that they moved in. Private renters who rely on state support to pay for their rent, either by universal credit or housing benefit, get the benefit paid at what's called the local housing allowance rate. And rather than being based on the actual rent that they pay, it's based on local rents for the area and the number of bedrooms which they're deemed to need. And also for most people under 35, the rate only covers the cost of a room in shared accommodation. And currently the rates are set to cover the cheapest 30% of properties in the local area. As the pandemic and lockdown progressed, enhanced support for private renters was made available, such as the extra support available via discretionary housing payments, which were brought in. And these meant that some applicants could get their full rent covered for 13 weeks. However, most private tenants who contacted Housing Rights weren't aware of this additional support. The impact of the 5-week wait for the first universal credit payment was also very stressful for many of the clients who contacted Housing Rights. For example, Carl was working for a company which furloughed its employees. However, he himself fell into what was referred to as a new starter furlough loophole, which meant that he wasn't able to be furloughed as he had only just started working for the company a short time before they closed. And so he had to be laid off. He had applied for help with housing costs at the time he was laid off, but still had a shortfall of £270 a month in his rent. However, he didn't get the additional 13-week protection to which he was entitled, which would cover the full cost of his rent, as he was told that he hadn't applied for it in time. Now, he was subsequently awarded this payment after advocacy by Housing Rights. Sharon was self-employed and was excluded from availing of the 13-week protection because she had already been in receipt of universal credit prior to losing her income. She found that she wasn't eligible for the self-employed scheme either, as she'd only recently started her business. Pre-existing conditions is a phrase that's more often related to healthcare, but it captures the essence of those who were already experiencing difficulties prior to the pandemic, which were exacerbated by the impact of the pandemic and the impact on the economy. For example, Matthew was dealing with significant debts and had been just about managing before being laid off as a result of the pandemic. When he contacted Housing Rights in May, he had nothing left to live on and had no means to pay his rent, which was coming due. Lucy then had been trying to get her life back together after her marriage breakdown and loss of her business the previous year. As the pandemic hit, she had just moved into an unfurnished property and she was finding the universal credit system difficult to navigate, but she had managed to get a loan from discretionary support, which amounted to just over £100. And this was all she had to live on until her first universal credit payment in 5 weeks' time. And obviously it wasn't enough for her to be able to get the furniture and the other things she needed to be able to stay in the property. There were several cases where clients were living with their partner and one or both of them had been affected by reduced income, leaving them unable to afford rent for the first time. So Nikki's partner was self-employed and she contacted Housing Rights regarding any support that might be available to help the family to cover their rent in the short term, while her partner was able to avail of the self-employed scheme. Whilst Nikki worked full-time herself, they weren't able to support their family on her income alone. And like many households in Northern Ireland, they had no savings to rely on in the meantime. For clients who were foreign nationals, it was common to see job losses experienced by one or both partners. And these families were also impacted by a lack of family support to help with childcare when the schools closed. So Alicia was a Spanish citizen who had moved to Northern Ireland from England in January of last year to take up work here. She's a single parent with 2 small children and had been able to support her family on her earnings prior to the pandemic. While she wasn't laid off, when schools closed, she found that she had no one to help with childcare and had no option but to leave her new job to take care of her children. So clients who were foreign nationals were also likely to be living in rented accommodation where the landlord wasn't registered. And this had implications for their ability to engage with, for example, a mediation service, or indeed to apply for help with their housing costs, in particular to get access for help with their rates. So there were issues which cut across these themes. For example, many clients discovered that their landlord wasn't registered at this time, which made the process of applying for universal credit and rates rebate more difficult. And this was the case for Nancy, who had never claimed benefits before and had been asked to pay rent in cash when she moved into her rental property, but had discovered that her landlord wasn't registered and he refused to provide the details she needed to complete her universal credit claim. Like a number of landlords, he had avoided renting his properties to people on benefits and wasn't willing to engage with her to help her progress her universal credit claim. In some cases, clients were helped by their landlord reducing or waiving rent payments, but even in these cases, they weren't necessarily straightforward. For example, Richard, who was self-employed, contacted Housing Rights after he was notified by his landlord that he would waive his rent for 3 months, which had seemed like great news. But he was told by his landlord then that the rent would increase after that by about £150 a month, which was just not going to be affordable for him. So some of our clients who were foreign nationals feared eviction and the impact that might have on their future visa status. Fear of evictions was a major concern for clients, particularly from May onwards and prior to the housing market opening up after lockdown. Landlords preparing to sell their properties was a common theme with regard to cases relating to notice to quit. Mary and her partner, for example, were both key workers who were issued with a notice to quit at the end of April last year, as their landlord had decided to sell the property, and they were faced with the difficulty of finding alternative accommodation as the notice to quit was issued during the full lockdown. In April last year, Christina and her family were given just 3 weeks to vacate their property, which their landlord had already sold. At the time, the notice to quit extension legislation hadn't come into effect, and Christina's landlord was entitled to provide only 4 weeks notice to quit, which still left the family in a hugely precarious situation. So it's been clear since the onset of the pandemic that home has been central to the response, with phrases such as shelter in place, stay at home, work from home becoming commonplace in the effort to protect ourselves and others from the virus. However, it's also clear from the evidence presented in this research that the ability to maintain and make use of our homes during this pandemic has been impacted by the economic shock, as well as the position we were in prior to the onset of the pandemic. Affordability issues were a common feature as a result of the pandemic. The extension of the notice to quit period was undoubtedly a major relief for many clients during this period, whilst the market opening in June brought some relief for those who were able to find alternative accommodation. There were many private tenants who were worried about finding it difficult to get access to a new tenancy because of their changed employment and income status. The pandemic and the economic shock which has followed has served to expose fault lines in the housing system, but there's perhaps the potential to use that knowledge gained to address those issues, which have always been there, but which have come into sharp focus as a result of the pandemic. And more than anything, this research has shown that the pandemic and subsequent lockdown has affected households in all manner of ways, but that those living in the private rented sector have been disproportionately affected. In part, this may be due to an increasing proportion of low-income households in the private rented sector, and as such, a policy change in favour of social and affordable housing will be key to a post-COVID recovery. The research has also shown that the support that many households received has been immensely helpful, but it also serves to remind us that whilst we're all in the same storm, we were definitely not in the same boat. So thanks very much. I'll just stop sharing the screen now.
Thanks very much, Martina. That was a very interesting insight into the systemic issues that have been brought into relief by COVID. It's always very, I think, important to look at the personal circumstances and to illustrate them as a key to understanding what was going on in the private rented sector. So thank you very much for that. It's also, I think it comes out again that many people in the private rented sector are vulnerable and were in those jobs that were most affected by COVID and therefore were most affected by this. That paper, I think, highlighted that. So thanks very much for that, Martina. I'm sure people will have questions for you afterwards.
Sure.
You're sticking around for the day, which I'm sure you are. But it does allow us to move on to the third paper we have for this afternoon. So this is the report on Threshold's annual tenant sentiment survey. These surveys are always very important because I do think they give us insights into what is going on in the sector. And it's very important to have those insights if you're making judgments and contributing to the debate. So Anne-Marie, may I ask you to share those with us?
Lovely, yeah. I'll just share my screen. And now, okay. So hopefully everyone can see that. So yes, good morning or good afternoon at this stage. So I'm delighted to present today on the findings from Threshold's fourth annual tenant sentiment survey, which we conducted in spring of this year. So I'll talk through the methodology and a number of the findings, focusing specifically on the aspirations and expectations of tenants, their experiences of renting, affordability, the impact of COVID-19 on private renters, and and a quick look at those who returned to live with their parents. And I'll finish up with a summary and a number of our Threshold's policy recommendations on foot of these findings. So we surveyed clients who had closed their cases with Threshold between January and June 2020 and who had given permission to be contacted for the purposes of research. And I would just like to say thank you to all who participated. 8 Threshold staff made the calls, and thank you to them also for undertaking that. It's no small piece of work to do. And so they carried out scripted quantitative interviews with the respondents. And respondents were given the opportunity to expand on their experiences throughout the survey, and these were noted by the interviewers. They were also asked if they would like a Threshold advisor to get in touch with them to support them with any issues they may be experiencing in their tenancy, and a number of respondents did avail of this, and they were put in touch with a Threshold advisor. So in all, 222 people were surveyed. 17 of these had returned to live with their parents, and these were asked a shorter set of questions. And the respondents are largely representative of Threshold's client group. So, as in other years, renters told us they do not rent out of choice. As you can see, only 26% are renting out of choice, over half rent as they cannot buy their own home, and 12% are unable to access social housing. And when we looked at this by age cohort, we see there's a much greater preference for renting among those aged 18 to 24. And this is understandable given their age, as they're unlikely to be seeking to buy. And if they are hoping to access social housing, they wouldn't be very long on the social housing list. And so you can see the red bar here indicates those who are renting by choice. And as you can see, nobody over the age of 54 stated that they are renting by choice. And when we asked where people would like to be living in 5 years' time, 61% stated they would like to own their own home, while only 20% wish to remain renting. However, less than a third of respondents actually expect to own their own home in 5 years' time, while 41% expect they will still be renting. So we can see here the red indicates people's aspirations, and as you can see, the 61% aspire to home ownership, but just about half of those actually expect to realise that. And the opposite then for those who aspire to be renting. So this, I suppose this illustrates the gap between people's aspirations and their expectations, as well as the lack of faith they may have in the ability of the housing system to meet these expectations. So when we asked how secure do you feel in your home, just under half, 47% stated they feel secure, a third do not feel secure, and the remainder felt neither secure or insecure. Now, taking a closer look, we see that those who are in their current home for more than 6 years were more likely to report feelings of insecurity. So you can see this here again, the red bar indicates feelings of insecurity, and for those who are renting more than 6 years, it's significantly higher than the other cohorts. Now, we also saw that those renting from their We also saw that those renting their current home for 5 years or more were more likely to report a negative relationship with the landlord. Now, it could be easily assumed that a tenant who has rented from a landlord for an extended period of time, or who would be living in the rental sector a lot longer, would have a more positive relationship. And this is not the case. And I refer to work by my fellow presenter, who's going to come on after me, Dr. Michael Byrne, who observed in research he conducted in partnership with Threshold last year that older tenants who've been renting for longer may be regarded as more seasoned tenants and more likely to challenge their landlord. If this is the case, it is likely to negatively affect their relationship with the landlord. And in addition, Byrne notes that nearly all tenants describe a positive, almost personal relationship with their landlord at the outset of the tenancy prior to any issues arising. And the relationship deteriorates once the tenant takes action to address an issue in the tenancy, and the risk of an issue arising increases the longer the tenancy in place. And if the relationship with the landlord is negatively impacted, this is likely to impact on the tenant's feelings of security in the home. So you can read a bit more about that in the full report. In respect of time renting, 79% of respondents have lived in the rented sector for 5 years or more. However, just over 1/5 have actually lived in their current home for that length of time. And over half of respondents reported that they are in their current home for less than 2 years. So this points to a high rate of churn, instability and lack of security in the private rented sector, with tenants facing frequent moves, often with little or no choice. So when we asked respondents why they left their last home, just over 40% stated they had left as a result of action by the landlord, the most common factor being the landlord's intention to sell. And this is something Threshold supports tenants with on a daily basis. It is the number one reason tenants come to us for advice on a notice of termination. So we asked then how difficult it is to find rental accommodation, and the overwhelming majority, 88%, stated it was difficult or extremely difficult to find a new home in the rental sector. And one interview said they had contacted over 200 landlords before securing a home. And 5 interviewees expanded to say that they felt they had faced discrimination on racial grounds or because they were eligible for HAP. So there was some variation in response by family type or household type. While all respondents indicated difficulty or extreme difficulty in securing a home, almost all of one-parent families, you see this over here on the far right, and 83% of two-parent families reported it is extremely difficult to find rental accommodation. So this may speak to a number of issues, and perhaps a landlord's reluctance to rent to families, the lack of affordable options or suitable housing close to schools, childcare, etc. And in the same research conducted by Dr. Byrne, which I just referenced, he also noted this, where those on HAP, parents with children and lone parents experienced extreme difficulty in finding alternative housing. So there's been quite a bit said on affordability so far today. So as a rule of thumb, it is expected that we should pay about 1/3 of our income on housing costs. Some say 40%. For the purposes of this, we kept it at 30%. However, just over half of respondents are paying more than that 30% on of their income on rent. Now, for those on higher incomes, paying 30% or more may have little impact on their disposable income or their quality of life. And so in this chart, you can see that broken down by income cohort. So the red, green and grey bars indicate the percentage of respondents paying more than 30% of their income on rent. And as you can see, a greater cohort of those earning less than 40,000, the lower 2/3 of the chart, are paying these rates of rent. And then as you move up into the upper third of the chart, we can see that the housing cost overburden is less pronounced for those earning above 40,000. Just under half are paying more than 1/3 of their take-home pay on rent. So we asked respondents about the impact COVID-19 has had on them. So 43% stated their income, they had lost income or their income had reduced on foot of the COVID-19 restrictions when non-essential retail services, construction, etc., shut down at any point in the preceding 12 months during the various lockdowns. However, only 10% of those had applied for rent supplement and HAP. So that is something that was a worry and a concern. And it was noted, particularly back in March, April, May, when we knew the COVID-19 restrictions were disproportionately impacting renters, but the take-up of rent supplement and HAP didn't reflect this. And what is also a concern is that only a minority, 9 respondents in total, registered with the Residential Tenancy Board as relevant persons to avail of the HANS protections from eviction. And when asked why they did not register, the overwhelming majority stated that they did not know about the protections or the need to register. In addition then, 37%, or just over 1/3, stated that the COVID-19 pandemic had affected their housing situation in some way. These respondents were more likely to live in house shares, be households without children, and have lost income during the pandemic. The main issues arising were increased arguments in the home. Many of the respondents spoke about their homes being too small, about the difficulty in having to work from home to keep themselves safe, and particularly when living with strangers. Then many stated that there were difficulties when housemates decided to move out, and then there were difficulties in finding new people to move in, and this meant that the remaining housemates were responsible for the full rent on the property. So 17 of respondents stated they had returned to live with their parents since they had been in contact with Threshold in early 2020. And when we asked why they moved back to the family home, some gave more than one reason. As you can see here, the primary reasons are financial. 1/3 stated they could no longer afford to pay rent. Just under 1/3 stated they had lost their job. And these two reasons weren't necessarily connected to each other. And just under 1/5 were trying to save a deposit for a mortgage. Now, 1/4 moved home for various reasons connected to the COVID-19 pandemic. For some, it was to be with family. For some, it was an opportunity to return to where they were from, which was now facilitated by remote working. 12% did say they had received a notice of termination and had moved home. However, they did not expand on whether this was out of choice or whether they had been unable to source alternative housing. So, in summary, this survey tells us that the lack of security, the poor standards, and high rents make the private rented sector an undesirable place to live. In its current form, it cannot offer a home for life. And Threshold has long advocated for changes to address not only these shortcomings in the private rented sector, but also in wider housing provision. And while there isn't time to go into the detail here today, the research revealed in particular the challenges facing single people in their 30s and older who are renting in house shares. It was clear in the research that these renters need and desire their own space, privacy, and independence, which is not possible for them at present living in the private rented sector. One lady in her late 20s spoke about how she finds it increasingly difficult to share with strangers, but does not expect she will ever buy her own home or receive an offer of social housing. In the survey, we also asked about standards, overcrowding, and people's experience of the housing assistance payment. Time does not permit me to go into all of these, but you can read about them in the full report. So to our recommendations, Threshold would like to see an increase in affordable housing options across tenures. And I think this is something that has come up in each of the presentations and all of the discussions so far. We also need to see improved security of tenure in the private rented sector. As it stands, a tenant can be evicted when there's been no wrongdoing on their part. And again, this is something that we see in Threshold every day when private renters bring us notices of termination. We need to see a move to long-term leasing as standard. This will allow people to create long-term secure homes in the private rented sector. And this is particularly important as people rent into older age, and this is already touched on earlier, that this has consequences for our pension system. We also need to see a review of HAP. Now, I know I didn't get to touch on this in the presentation, but you, as I said, you can read about it in the report. And this review of HAP needs to include an increase in the rates that are paid. We need to see changes in the administration of HAP to allow for rent to be paid from the date the tenancy begins, for the rent to be paid up front, and for the payment of a deposit. Threshold has long advocated also for an NCT for housing to ensure the minimum standards of housing are met in the rental sector. And finally, we have advocated for a national housing strategy for single people. And this is necessary to ensure that the need to rent a room in a shared house is eliminated, particularly as more people are likely to rent for life. So thanks very much for listening, and I look forward to your questions.
Thanks very much, Marie. We just need to take down your slides. Yeah, great. Thanks very much, Anne-Marie. That was very interesting. Loads of stuff coming up there. One of the things that struck me about it is that, you know, one often hears that people have a choice in housing. And what comes out of that for me is that really, in a lot of cases, people in the private rented sector don't have real choice. As economists might understand it, that they're forced into the private rented sector for all sorts of reasons to do with their circumstances. So it's not a choice, something you would choose to do. And I think that has implications. The other one that struck me about that is that the feelings of insecurity are there, and they are there often not only because of the circumstances that their landlord-tenant relationships, but rather it's because they may have feelings of insecurity around rents going up around them, or about their own income circumstances. And that often when commentators debate the private rented sector, they feel that the best way of dealing with this is to increase security for tenure for tenants, but that might not be actually addressing the real issue of that motivation for feeling insecure. It's often the case. The other point, if I just take a couple of minutes to make this point, which I always try and make when talking about security of tenure, and that is that, in fact, tenants in Ireland have quite a degree of security of tenure if they rent from institutions rather than private landlords, because, as you pointed out, a landlord can end a tenancy if they want to live in the house themselves or if they want to sell. And other than that, the tenant is pretty secure in the accommodation they have, provided they pay the rent and keep the conditions. So if you rent from an institution landlord who is unlikely to sell, and that's the reason they have the property, they can't, the institutional landlord can't move into the property, can't require it for their own family protection. So if you are looking for security of tenure in the private rented sector, you will achieve that by trying to rent from an institutional landlord rather than an accidental or an amateur landlord. It's just a point I choose to make a lot of the time because I think people miss that point. So Anne-Marie, thanks very much. I think we'll come back to that in the afternoon. As I said before, there's loads of interesting questions that might come out of that. And we'll kind of quickly move on to our last contributor. And I think there's going to be a symmetry between you and what Michael is going to talk to us about. Michael Byrne is a lecturer in the School of Social Policy, Social Work and Social Justice in UCD. And he's going to talk to us about the experience of renters during the COVID pandemic. I'll be very interested myself to hear about this and to hear the information you've gathered. So I'll hand over to you. Thanks very much. Mick, is it?
Yeah, great. Thanks a million, Tom. I'll just switch over to the share screen mode. Okay, so that's all visible, I guess. Yeah, so thanks a million to the conference organizers, Threshold and the ESRI. This is a great opportunity for myself and Juliana Sassi from the Department of Geography and Maynooth, who worked with me on this project. It's qualitative research on tenants' experience during the pandemic that we've just completed. So we conducted the qualitative interviews for this project in spring of 2021 and finished them up in May, so very recently. And before I jump in, just two quick notes. One is to say that the findings are to some extent preliminary. We're more or less finished this project, but we haven't had the chance to look into every aspect of the findings just yet. And the other thing is just to say that due to reasons of time, I won't have much of an opportunity to talk about the background to the research design, the methodology, and so on, because I want to use pretty much all the time that we have to talk about the findings. So what I'll do is I'll look at the main findings across the different aspects of the research. But just some brief words on the background. Yeah, very much I would echo Martina McAuley's term and analysis of the interaction between COVID-19 and the private rental sector as a kind of perfect storm, because obviously we know from the fairly widespread research now in Ireland and internationally that we had very significant challenges in the private rental sector prior to the pandemic, both in terms of the affordability issues and in terms of a wider set of issues that particularly affect the more liberal and Anglophone PRS regimes, such as insecurity of tenure, also the issue around poor quality dwellings, and some other issues that affect tenants' experience of home. And the pandemic then really collided with those existing set of issues and did so in ways that have particular impacts on tenants in the private rental sector. And there's two sides to that. Obviously, home, a secure, safe, stable refuge, became much more important in the context of the pandemic and the associated public health measures. On the other hand, there's the labour market side, and particularly the fact that tenants are overrepresented in the sectors of the economy which were most impacted by the pandemic. So what we wanted to do with the research was really to record and capture how these different sets of factors interacted to shape tenants' experiences of housing and home during the pandemic. And we focused on a couple of issues in particular: the income, employment, rent, affordability side of things, the issues around insecurity of tenure or insecure occupancy, as Hulse and Milligan call it, and issues, the kind of wider issues around the experience of home for tenants. We also look at the impact of the specific policy measures introduced to target the private rental sector, especially the eviction ban. The research itself, I don't have a huge amount of time to talk about the research design and methodology, but it consisted in 35 in-depth qualitative interviews carried out in spring 2021 by myself and Juliana Sassi. And we looked at 3 different cohorts. So we took one geographical area, which was Wicklow, and Wicklow has a variety of sub-markets within its rental market. So there's high rent areas like Greystones, there's relatively low rent areas like Wicklow Town, and then areas in between like Bray. So it captures a kind of a wide diversity of experiences in that regard. And then we looked at 2 cohorts who are overrepresented in the sector. First of all, lone parents who, as we know, are overrepresented as renters generally, and also research such as what we've just heard from Anne-Marie and other research by Murphy and Hearn, for example, have identified that lone parents experience particular issues in the private rental sector on a number of levels. And we also wanted to look at the migrant experience, because migrant households are so strongly overrepresented in the sector. So I think non-EU born households, from the census 2016 data, it's around 68% of those households are in the private rental sector, whereas it's just around 13% of Irish born households. So we really wanted to capture that experience, and we focused on the Brazilian community. I should say, in this presentation, I won't have the chance to focus too much on the differences between those different cohorts or the specific experiences of any one of them. I'm more so going to look at the cross-cutting themes, so the issues that emerged across the sample, but those would be issues that we will surely address in future publications. Okay, so what did we find across these 3 areas? Well, I want to start with income, employment, and rent. Unsurprisingly, a large majority of our sample did experience some kind of impact on employment and income. And for the large majority of these, this involved unemployment for a part or all of the pandemic. However, about half of them, or about a third of the overall sample, didn't experience a significant decline in their income as a result of this, because it was offset by income and housing supports. So 50% were in receipt of the PUP at some stage, and 20% of the sample applied for and received some form of housing support during the pandemic, on top of the 20% of the sample who were already in receipt of a support going into the COVID-19 pandemic. Participants also raised the decline in expenditure as a factor, mitigating some of the impact on employment, referencing childcare costs and transport costs in particular. But certainly this aspect of the research is quite consistent with the research Conor talked about earlier, published last summer, which models the impact of the labour market shock on tenants in the private rental sector, and suggested that a lot of that, or a significant amount of that, would be offset by income supports and other factors. However, around 37% of the sample did experience a significant decline in income, and they coped with this via loans from family, dipping into savings, and again foregoing other forms of expenditure. Everything from pension contributions to holidays were mentioned in that regard. Just to touch briefly on rent arrears, only one of our participants entered rent arrears during the pandemic. However, something that came across very, very strongly, especially I should say in terms of the lone parent cohort, was that tenants are extremely reluctant to miss a rent payment and therefore enter into arrears. So one tenant, for example, when asked, "Have you missed a rent payment?" responded, "Never. I have to pay my rent. That's my priority. If I don't pay my rent, I could be homeless. It's my number one priority. I don't want to get in trouble with my landlord." And that phrase, "paying my rent is my number one priority," came up again and again in our interviews. And when we take that in conjunction with what we've just been talking about in terms of the last slide, I think it suggests that we need to be cognizant of the economic impact on tenants beyond the issue of rent arrears, given the economic impacts that we've been talking about this morning in general, but also given the fact that tenants are extremely reluctant to enter into rent arrears, and therefore likely to maintain rent payments and instead fall behind on other areas of expenditure, which I think is important to keep in mind over the next period. Only about a quarter of the overall sample requested a rent reduction. Of those, very few actually ended up with a rent reduction, either because their request was refused by the landlord or because what was offered would involve some kind of deferred payment, accumulating rent debt, and that was something that tenants expressed a lot of reluctance around as well. So echoes there of Martina's presentation that we've just heard. Okay, so I'll move on now to experiences of home in the sense of a secure, safe, stable dwelling which the resident can exercise control of. So that's informed by the now pretty established body of research on what home is, specifically in the private rental sector. Some tenants did experience their home in a positive fashion during the pandemic, and some tenants even felt more positive about their home. Many tenants described themselves as feeling lucky or grateful because they became more aware of the benefits of their home in the context of the lockdown, etc. However, there was a very significant number of tenants who in one way or another, did not have access to a home in the full sense of the term. 23% of the sample explicitly described their dwelling as not being a home, not feeling like home. 40% said they didn't feel secure, echoes of Anne-Marie's presentation there. 37% experienced significant minimum standards issues, and 20% described their relationship with their landlord as bad. Again, echoing some of the findings that Anne-Marie presented. And from the analysis of the qualitative data, we identified three major factors that undermined tenants' experience of home during the pandemic. So insecurity, minimum standards issues, and then a lack of control or inability to personalize the dwelling. We have this aspect of the findings has been published as a working paper by the Geary Institute of Public Policy. If people are interested, it's available on publicpolicy.ie. So I just want to look at these three issues that undermine tenants' experience of home in turn, with just a brief reference to some of the qualitative data. In terms of insecure occupancy or feelings of insecurity, this was an issue which tenants tended to describe as a pervasive aspect of their experience as renters, rather than as a consequence of the pandemic. So it seemed to be more an issue of a perception of insecurity accumulated throughout their time as renters. That, of course, shaped their experience of the pandemic, but it didn't necessarily arise as a result of the pandemic. One tenant, a 40-year-old female tenant from Wicklow, says, I've learned not to think of anywhere as home. I tend not to get attached to places. It's not worth the heartache. I don't ever feel secure in a rental property, etc., etc. And at this stage, if we look at the qualitative research in Ireland, but also in similar regimes like England, Scotland and Wales, Australia, New Zealand, there's really a quite very substantial qualitative evidence of this aspect, this experience of insecurity of tenure in those types of regimes. Minimum standards issue was something that participants talked about in relation to their experience of the pandemic, something that was compounded essentially by spending so much time at home. Obviously, by spending more time at home, minimum standards issues such as lack of hot water, for example, or a lack of an important appliance like a washing machine, they're going to impact more the more time you spend at home. But also there was an impact in terms of the additional frustration. Participants talked about, staring at the damp all day, and frustration at not being able to control that or resolve the issue. So one tenant from a lone parent tenant from Waterford said, you're spending more time at home and you're very aware of all the problems that would grate on you and drive you crazy. It's a more constant feeling of entrapment almost. There was a real pressure on me. I have to somehow get out of this house. I don't want my daughter to grow up here. It really put an onus on me to try and better her life, etc., etc. And that was that type of description was reasonably common among those participants with significant minimum standards issues. Frustrations around inability to personalize a home, inability to adapt a home to the residents' needs, and inability to make a home feel more homely was also something that was compounded by the COVID-19 pandemic. And this, again, came up quite frequently due to the fact that participants were using their home for more types of activities, and there was more pressure on space, as we all know. But also, again, that frustration that arises from spending so much time at home, but being unable to do simple things like hang a painting on the wall. A lot of participants talked about not being able to do any gardening or have flower pots and those types of issues. Okay, I will move on to the last issue I want to look at, because I am conscious of time. The eviction ban. So we know from the homelessness data, for example, that the eviction ban appears to have been successful in relation to its immediate objective of eliminating evictions and reducing household mobility during the pandemic. And none of our sample were evicted or experienced a termination of tenancy during the pandemic itself. It's also important, I think, to emphasize that 86% of the sample were aware of the eviction ban, which is a success in itself, because we also looked at the widening of the rent supplement eligibility criteria and the so-called relevant person scheme. And very few participants had heard of either of those two interventions, something that the threshold research presented by Anne-Marie just now also identified. So tenants were aware of it, and some tenants did experience a positive impact in terms of how secure they felt. So that's what we were primarily interested in this piece of research, was given that tenants had effectively complete security of tenure for the first time, how did that impact on their actual experience of security and home during this period? So for around 20% of the sample, it was positive, and a couple of participants spoke at length about the positive impact and how it made it easier to cope with negotiating with landlords, for example, during the period. But the large majority did not experience enhanced security as a result of the eviction ban. And that was for three reasons. First of all, it was temporary. This was the most important reason. And I think this is interesting because it suggests that one of the most important things about security of tenure for tenants is that it delivers security in relation to future uncertainties. And the eviction ban didn't really do this because it was in place at different stages, but it was always time limited, and tenants were very aware of the fact that it was time limited and therefore didn't protect them from future uncertainty. Another issue raised by some tenants was that they didn't believe their landlord would comply with the legislation. And in all of those cases, they referred there to past experience of non-compliance on the part of landlords. And then finally, a number of participants raised the issue that while the eviction ban could protect a tenant at a legislative level from eviction, it couldn't protect them from the ensuing conflict with their landlord if they had to advocate for themselves against their landlord in relation to an eviction or the termination of a tenancy. And so quite a few said, yes, it's there on paper, but if the landlord wants me out, that's going to lead to a lot of conflict, a lot of stress. And that echoes findings from the research that myself and Rachel McArdle did published last summer with Threshold that Anne-Marie mentioned. Okay, I'll just move on to the last slide now, and just some brief conclusions. I'll just touch on a few of them. The second one there, the economic impact, I think, needs to be considered beyond rent arrears, which is not to say that dealing with rent arrears isn't a very important issue. But the economic impact goes beyond that, especially given how the extreme difficulty tenants have finding alternative accommodation, which the data presented by Anne-Marie underlines, and how reluctant tenants are to enter into rent arrears as a result of that, in large part. And then the fourth and fifth aspects there, which I think are really the most significant. But many tenants, many of our research participants endured the pandemic, a period in which they were spending the vast majority of their time in their house without access to a real home, a secure, stable home, a place they could control, etc., a place they felt secure. And I think that is important to recognize, because that has been an incredibly difficult experience for our participants. And there's also potential long-term effects there. But I think most importantly, in some respects, it highlights the issue of tenure inequality. So the inequality in access to an experience of home experienced by private renters as opposed to other tenures. And the research on so-called generation rent over the last 5 or 6 years has, I think it's increasingly being pointing in this direction. But the COVID-19 pandemic, the perfect storm, really underlines it, and therefore I think really demands that we start to address this issue for once and for all. So thank you for your attention, and I will leave it at that.
Thanks, Mick, and thanks to Juliana for the input that she put into your research. It's well that you acknowledge that. So that threw up some very interesting issues, all right. One of the things that often illustrates something is a pithy phrase like the one you used there that came from that woman who's, I think, 40 years old, you said, who said that she learned not to get attached to places. You know, that's a very sad statement from a 40-year-old woman who's probably looking forward to not being able to buy her own home or get security accommodation for a long time. And it does point to the insecurity that people feel in the private rental sector. And I think that captured and would capture, you know, a deficiency that is there in the private rental sector, Mick. That was very good. The other one that comes up, of course, is that quality of dwellings. And I think you related that very well to the third point you pointed out there, the lack of control. I often think myself that one of the problems in the private rental sector is just that very point, that if you're a family and you're living in the private sector, we all who've, you know, had families, and all of us have, but brought up families with children, know that at periods you do need to switch your accommodation a good bit in terms of the internal use, and you need to be able to control your accommodation as a family grows, as they face changing circumstances. And I've often thought that this old tradition in Ireland of renting out accommodation plus the furniture, plus often the kitchen utensils, is not the most ideal way of doing it. And it might be better to move to a grey box or a white box solution where people who have long-term security of tenure could move in and bring their own furniture and adopt the house over the time, provided the property is left in good condition at the end. So there's something that needs to be put there. And it was also heartening to hear that those supports did mitigate the worst aspects of the economic hit of COVID. That's quite important, I think, and the government response in that area is often not correctly given as much applause as it should be. The government certainly stepped up and helped people greatly. I'd hate to think of what would have happened if we didn't do that as a nation in the private rental sector. So Mick, I think that was very, very interesting, and thanks very much for that. We've had a very interesting 4 speakers. There was a couple of questions that arose there. I see Di Downey mentioned that the significant role of fiscal policy in housing is also something that's of importance. And he pointed out also that rule of thumb approaches to resolving issues in the private sector, even discussing them, may not be as useful as people think they are. He pointed out that, you know, way back in the 1980s, and I remember this myself, 20 to 25% of income was looked upon as being normal. That has been elevated now to 35%. So there's a question mark there. And Rory Hearn, I think, made an interesting point where he said that institutional investors are involved in churn, where they move tenants out of accommodation into other accommodation, which may be so. I don't know what the extent of that is, and certainly that's something that should be researched. And secondly, he made the point that they charge on average higher rents, which may be the case, but often that's a reflection of the additional services and the fact that people might be prepared to pay more for accommodation that comes from a landlord where there's additional security of tenure, as I mentioned earlier on. So I think we've had a very interesting morning. It's nearly 1 o'clock. Can I move to thank the 4 contributors this morning, Conor, Martina, Anne-Marie, and Mick, and thank them for keeping to time. Remarkable, I must say, because normally in conferences somebody overruns, but all the speakers this morning adhered to their brief in a very exemplary way. There's issues, I think, coming out of all those presentations, which will be interesting to discuss this afternoon. And I'm looking forward to this myself, because I think we've got an interesting set of panelists who will respond to those things. Certainly that insecurity of tenure, insecurity, maybe not just of tenure, but insecurity in the private rental sector is a big issue for people. I was interested in that point that was made earlier on too, about positive relations between landlords and tenants only up to the point where issues arise. And that's a kind of an interesting issue that might be explored a bit. So I think we can look forward to a very interesting afternoon. There's a couple of things coming in there on the chat, which I'm sure you'll all see. And I look forward to coming back at 2 o'clock. We are due to come back at 2, as I said, so we've got a good hour for lunch, which is adequate, I think. And the chair for the afternoon will be Aideen Hayden of Threshold. So I certainly look forward to seeing you all on the screen or hearing the contributions you're going to make this afternoon. Thank you very much for the participation, and we'll close now until 2 o'clock.